me just turn this light off for a second. Just
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll just wait like one more minute to see if anyone else joins us, but welcome.
that sure is a beautiful photo.
It is. All right, it looks like we are all set. So again, welcome this morning. Thank you so much for joining us here for a virtual tour of the Timken. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted throughout today's lecture and save your questions for the end of today. If you do have a question and you would like to type it in the chat, please feel free. There's a chat box down below that you can use if you're joining us over Zoom. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, you can use the comment section there and type in your question, and we'd be happy to answer that at the end as well. Finally, this lecture is being recorded and it is being, as I said, broadcast live on Facebook. If you would like to go back and watch any of these lectures, today's lecture or any previous lectures that we've done, please check out our Facebook page, our YouTube page, and other social media in order to find those. But otherwise though, we're so excited to have our docent today, Karen, presenting on landscape paintings at the Timken, and I will go ahead and turn that over to her.
I have a question.
Oh yeah, sure, Sharon.
Sure. You've got some tours coming up of the Getty in August.
Yes, that is correct. If you go to the Timken website, you should be able to find more information on those.
And are they presented by the Timken docents or Getty docents? Who's the presenters? Thanks.
I believe it's Getty, isn't it?
They're presented by Getty docents. Yes, that's correct. And yes, you can go to our website and you can find that information.
Yeah, I just signed up for one, so thanks.
Oh, perfect. Yay, we're so excited to have you.
Not as excited as I am.
Thank you so much, Sharon. All right, perfect. So I'll go ahead and turn this over to Karen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Well, landscape painting is one of my favorite topics, and it is, there's so many components to it. And first of all, I just want to say that we are going to concentrate on landscapes in Western art, because there is a rich and beautiful tradition of Chinese landscape painting beginning in about the 6th century. And the Chinese landscape painters mostly did ink, paper and ink. So that is a very complex and interesting topic, but we're going to concentrate mostly on what's happening in Europe and in the United States in the 19th century, because that is what we have so much of in our Timken collection. Beautiful Renaissance, Baroque, and of course Hudson River landscapes. Now, landscapes really were very popular in ancient Rome. For example, wall paintings were done and recorded, landscapes and the countryside, but that was kind of abandoned, and landscape tradition sort of took a back step up until about the Renaissance. Now, we're going to look at the evolution of landscape painting, and we'll start with an exquisite illuminated manuscript. So this Le Très Vicieux of the Duc de Berry, early 15th century manuscript, is about 206 pages on vellum. It is one of the finest late medieval / International Gothic style manuscripts ever created. The Limburg brothers were Dutch. And as you know, the French had a very strong presence in Holland, particularly about 40 years after this was done. The Duke of Burgundy came into Holland about 1460, 66, and had a very strong presence until the Habsburgs came in. And then, of course, we had the separation of Holland and Belgium. So these were books of hours. They were canonical prayers. And they were also, so it was Catholic prayers, but also calendars. And what you see are these exquisite depictions of not only the architecture of that time, the landscape of this early 15th century time, and also the peasants at work. Now, because the Dutch and Flemish painters, at this time, this is Netherlandish, meaning when Holland and Belgium were still connected, because these were Dutch painters and the French peasants. These artists trained to work with jewelry, manuscript illumination, so they were extremely careful with the depiction of everything from the animals to the buildings. They use oftentimes one-haired horse tail brushes to create such detailed manuscripts. Now, they use all natural pigments. This is washes of cobalt blue. Any gold you would see would be gold leaf oftentimes. Look at this exquisite crenellated castle. The crenellation are these square or rectangular forms, but weaponry could be thrust through. We have peasants in the field. We have crops and they're picking, and we have the animals, and you have some aspect of perspective. You see the horses going over the drawbridge, and it's just an exquisite depiction of what life looked like in late medieval with the style of international Gothic. Now, there's some interesting aspects of this painting. First of all three artists died around 1416, right after this was done. It was actually not completed for many centuries. The Duc de Berry, who commissioned this, also died very shortly after it was done. And the reason why they call it Les Trevicheuses is because when people came after the death of this fantastic Duke who commissioned all kinds of handmade books, they called it Les Trevicheuses, the very rich hours, the hours, the canonical hours. The other thing I want to point out is, why were books handmade? Well, of course, you probably recall that Gutenberg creates the movable type and the printing press around 1440. So up until that time, books were all handmade. So who had access to books? The aristocracy and the Catholic Church. So this was made for a very wealthy person, and it was all handmade. Now, it was eventually finished over the course of a couple centuries, and the 206 pages are all intact today. So this is kind of the background of landscape painting. So let's go into the Renaissance. Now, most of the paintings done during the Renaissance, this is 16th century, were really focused on, even though there was landscape involved, there was almost always a religious, which would be biblical, mythological or historical component to the landscape. And one of the most beautiful works of art we have in our Timken, and one of my favorite paintings, someone once said, if you could take a painting out of the Timken, probably I would take this. And this is the Parable of the Sower by the great Northern Renaissance painter, Pieter Bruegel. Again, looking at the dates, it is still a Netherlandish area, the Low Countries, Holland and Belgium. It's about 1609 when these countries are separated. Pieter Bruegel was a Catholic, but he did paint both Protestant, because this is the advent of the Protestant Reformation. So he did Protestant and Catholic themes. Here he creates an exquisite aerial perspective. And as I mentioned, in the 16th century, landscape paintings were developing, but they weren't an independent genre, which we begin to see in the 17th century. So let's talk a little bit about this painting. It's done in a remarkable aerial perspective. Now, I told you, these are the Low Countries, Holland and Belgium. If you've ever visited, you know that there's no mountain ranges. Why are there mountain ranges in this depiction of really his landscape of his homeland? It's because Bruegel went to Italy and he saw the Alps, the Italian Alps, and he became fascinated with this rocky mountain range. So he decides to use artistic license and incorporate this painting. What's also very remarkable about this painting is we have a very distinct foreground, middle ground, and background. And in the foreground, we have a farmer sowing seeds. Well, the importance of this painting, the parable of the sower from Matthew, Luke, and John is what you sow, you shall reap. So he's sowing seeds for a crop, but in the background of the painting, we see Jesus proselytizing on the shoreline. So that is a metaphorical reference to what you sow, you shall reap. If you gather people together and proselytize, you may create converts. You also have something very important to the landscape. In the center is the church. So again, this is a reference to the Christian reference of this painting, its parable. And then we have some remarkable details. You know, the men on horseback going along a trail, you have the cottages bathed in light, and these exquisite trees with the birds flying in the clouds. Remember, the Dutch and Flemish, particularly the Dutch, and very much in the 17th century, were so interested in light, and they were interested in the depiction of nature and focusing on nature. So we can see that this exquisite Renaissance landscape, Northern Renaissance landscape, shows that landscapes were developing, but that really they were always kind of matched with a different theme. However, let's go on to another masterpiece in the Timken, and that is Van Ruysdael. Jacob van Ruysdael was Dutch, and by this time, 1665, Holland was a separate nation. It had broken away from the Habsburgs. It was involved in wars for something like 80 years. But during the Reformation, with Luther and Calvinism, Lutheranism and Calvinism, the Dutch became Protestant. And in Belgium, another part of the Low Countries, they stayed with the Habsburg Empire and maintained their Catholic status. So things that are happening in this country is that Holland becomes a very developed economy. They're great explorers, they're scientists. Von Leeuwenhoek discovers the microscope, so they're looking at optical devices. They're looking at weather and nature. They have a developed military. They're traders. It's a very strong economy, which had originally been in Antwerp. Now it's in Amsterdam. The reason why I'm talking about the background of this is I want you to know that at this time, the Dutch could start to commission, middle-class people could commission artists to paint paintings in the genre of landscape and not necessarily connected with a biblical or mythological or historical theme. So what we have here is a traditional landscape. Even though there's some metaphorical references, and I will explain those in a minute, this is the genre of landscape. Just as still life is a genre, portraiture is a genre. By the 17th century, particularly in Holland, landscapes become its own genre. What do we have here? We have a remarkable depiction of the bleaching fields of Haarlem. And Haarlem, if you take a train, I visited this town, it's very lovely. It's about an hour and a half train ride outside of Amsterdam. So it is connected economically, and it was connected economically to Amsterdam. And I want to show you, so the bleaching fields here, we have, I believe it's linen being bleached. It could be cotton. Sometimes I believe it's linen. So this is linen being bleached, and you can actually see small figures in the fields. This part of Holland, Haarlem, was very big on these bleaching fields and in this industry. We have the dunes with a little bit of what also looks maybe like topsoil. I'm not quite sure. We have the cottages, and in the horizon we have St. Baudel's Cathedral. Now, Van Ruysdael, one of the greatest landscape painters of the 17th century in Holland, was buried in St. Baudel's. St. Baudel's had originally been a Catholic church, but with the Protestant Reformation, it became Protestant. What do we have here that's so remarkable to me is this very identifiable low horizon line. Van Ruysdael was noted for his low horizon lines, and it captures this incredible cloud formation of cumulus clouds. But, pardon me, but one thing I do want you to notice is that the cloud formations have a little bit of an ominous quality to it. And what he was saying, Van Ruysdael, was metaphorically referencing the fact that life was ephemeral and life was often short during the 17th century, so that we could never know what can happen around the corner. And the Dutch and Flemish painters, particularly in their still lives, often incorporated something metaphorical, a vanitas, meaning it's a symbolic reference to something about life and behavior and moral values. So here we have the reference of life is ephemeral. The clouds can pour rain and things can change at any time. So now we're going to move on, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Claude Lorrain. Claude Lorrain was definitely influenced by some of the other landscape painters of the the French Baroque, like Nicolas Poussin. And here we have what's called an Arcadian landscape. So what is an Arcadian landscape? Well, you know, there's different categories of landscape. We have something like sublime landscapes, and this would be considered a sublime landscape. Why? Because man is coexisting very peacefully in nature. Arcadian landscapes refer to the Greek and Roman concept. Virgil, the Roman poet, talked about the Arcadian landscapes of being, you know, heaven on earth kind of thing, where everything is quiet and calm and superlative. And so that's what Laurent is commenting on. So it's this beautiful light-filled landscape, and we have the light is so prominent. Laurent was so interested in light and landscapes that he would go into the landscape and lie on his back and sketch and try to see how the light changed. And you find this out later, 200 years later, when Monet, for example, did the same thing, would study the same landscapes and try to capture the light and time of day. Now we think this is probably beginning to be dusk, and you can see the cows are being shepherded across the little bit of water body here. We have some ruins in the background, and we have a shepherd having his feet washed by a young woman. And then we have in the middle ground, we see a mountain range and then these exquisite waterfall. And again, some more ruins on the right and these exquisite trees. They're very interested in depicting nature very naturally. A little bit of interesting thing about Laurent, he was actually a baker by trade. And he gave that up because he fell in love with art and began painting, particularly landscapes. Now, I wanted to point out something that I don't want to get too far into the talk without mentioning something. In Italy, for example, and we're going to look at an Italian cityscape, Italy in about the 16th century begins to incorporate landscape in other paintings. For example, if you look at even the Mona Lisa in 1502 by Leonardo da Vinci, you begin to see how landscape starts to permeate even portraiture. Again, it's not often that our landscapes are depicted with just a landscape in mind. However, what is very important to the development of landscape is the idea of the study of perspective. As Renaissance artists are grappling with concepts of perspective, they begin to use the landscape because the landscape is a perfect way to try to perfect aspects of perspective. And even some of the French in the 18th century, later a man named Balacen even wrote about how landscape could really help artists understand perspective. Now, I'm going to move on to Venetian painting, and I just want to make a quick comment. I do believe that the date is could be incorrect on this. It's no date, ND, but actually it's done a little bit earlier. So let's look at this painting more as a late Baroque painting from the 17th century, maybe 1680, I believe. Okay, so what are we looking at? And you might say, well, this isn't really a landscape. I don't see any trees. But you have to understand that there's sort of subcategories. And the subcategory of landscape painting is, of course, cityscapes and marine paintings. So this, of course, is a cityscape, the Piazzetta at Venice. So what is the Piazzetta? The Piazzetta is the territory before the Piazza San Marco in Venice. And it is captured very nicely by Caravalis, Luca Caravalis. And Caravalis, although he has a Dutch name, was actually Italian. And he spent a lot of time in Italy. And he began to document Venice. Now, he was really ahead of his time because before Canaletto and Guardi became famous for depicting Venice and the grand tour that many upper class youths took, it was Carnavalis who began to study Venice. So let's talk about this painting, this cityscape, the landscape of an urban area. And we have a very interesting perspective because Carnavalis captures this piazzetta and the piazza from down below in the canals, because as you know, Venice is, even today, is a city of canals. And I was there about September 2019, and I remember, because I talked about this painting and I love this painting, how does it differ from what's there? And it's pretty spot on. There's some differences, like for example, the Campanile here is cut off, and we have the Library of San Savino, beautifully depicted, and the Doge's Palace. The Doge, of course, was the prince, and you have these arcades and colonnades and balustrades remarkably depicted. Now, you might say, look at the complex nature of this cityscape. It is. I mean, you have the perspective beautifully done. It brings your eye all the way to this medieval St. Mark's, early medieval it began, St. Mark's Cathedral, and you have multitudes of people. Carnavalis studied mathematics, and that's why he was able to capture this remarkable perspective. And also, he was a great figurative artist. So between Trajan's column here and St. Mark's symbol here, we have all these people. And what are they doing? Well, it was a fowl market, an FOWL market, and the fowl traders are here. You can even see the bird cages, and they finished their day's work. It's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. They finished their day's work, and they are, talking and exchanging ideas after the birds are sold. And we have some more of like aristocratic people, and you have some very interesting costumes. You can see turbans and fezzes. And why is that? Because Venice was a great trading center in the 17th century, and it was on the Adriatic and a series of lagoons. So it was often many people from all over came to trade in Venice. So here is our Venetian Baroque cityscape. Now, Philippe de Champagne did this Christ healing the blind. And this is a very complex painting. There's a lot to say about this painting. First of all, as we saw in the parable of the sower, this is also a parable from Matthew, Luke, and John. And the parable of the sower talks about Christ healing the blind, but it also is a subliminal reference to de Champagne's Catholic origins. He was at Janus, and which is a very strict order during the 17th century. And in fact, the Catholic Church somewhat rejected it. They thought it was too individually driven, not enough under the auspices of the Catholic Church. But it was created and developed in the vein of the Counter-Reformation. So remember, as I told you, the Reformation begins in the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation. And by the latter part of the 16th century and into the 17th century, there's this bifurcation of Catholic and Protestant countries, for example, Holland and Belgium. And the Catholic Church is still trying to maintain control. And so many times when they had artists doing artwork, they would ask them to do, quote, propaganda-like paintings to make them so beautiful and remarkable and interesting that people would look at them and continue to be enamored with the Catholic Church. You can definitely see that a lot in the Spanish Baroque, particularly the two paintings in our museum. Well, one in particular, the Murillo, the crucifixion, Christ on the cross. You can see this dramatic, beautiful painting that tries to bring people into Catholicism. So let's talk more specifically about this painting. As we looked at the Pieter Bruegel, we also see somewhat of an aerial perspective here. It opens up the vista quite remarkably. We also have disciples and prophets following Christ, who's in purple and blue robes, to heal these men emerging from a hut to bestow light on them, the ability to see. And then we have people talking in awe and admiration of Christ. We also have this remarkable fortress here, just exquisite, with this rocky promontory with, again, a castle-like structure here. And the light is so exquisite. He had seen the work of Peter Paul Rubens, in Paris. He was actually Belgian by birth and then went to Paris. So he knew the work of Rubens. He knew the work of other great, who am I trying to think of? I'll move on from that. Poussin, for example. So he incorporated a lot of their landscape developments. But again, this light-filled sky, the very detailed shrubbery and trees, and the light-filled, hilltop and beautiful ruins. So this is a religious painting. As I mentioned, really wasn't until the Dutch really started doing these middle-class genre paintings that we have separate landscapes. So again, as I mentioned, mythological, historical, or biblical, and this of course relates to a landscape with the biblical idea. Now, Vernet, Claude Joseph Vernet, was French, and he was a marine painter, and he was also a really brilliant figurative painter. He did amazing figurative elements, but he did marine paintings. And he spent a lot of time in Italy. So we have a seaport at sunset, which is really more of an Italian seaport. And so let's talk about it. Again, he incorporates what he saw with the Dutch. And the Dutch had those very low horizon lines, as I showed you with the Van Rysdale. So we have a very low horizon line. And then we have some interesting things going on. We actually have what's called a composite landscape. Well, why is that? Well, we have the Arch of Constantine that is not at the seaport. And we have the Lighthouse of Naples here, which is not in the seaport. And we have some ruins up here, a wall, a fortress wall. And then we have these ships that are kind of displaying their might and power. And if you notice, this is not the French flag, this is the Dutch flag. Because as I mentioned, the Dutch were great traders and explorers. And so we believe most likely a Dutch patron commissioned Vernet to do this painting. And he did it gladly. And we see the cannons firing. We see a large grouping of ships, because oftentimes, for example, the Dutch would have like their whole regatta go out into a harbor to show their might. And that is also true sometimes with the English and so forth. But here we have sort of a Dutch a regatta here circling around in the harbor. And we have some interesting things happening. So remember, if you see toward the center right, we have a man in classic turban. So again, it shows that in the age of exploration and beyond, and even earlier, we had the French, the British, the Italians, the Dutch, going in to explore. And of course, the French became very prodigious colonizers. I mentioned yesterday, they went into Asia, Southeast Asia, they went into Africa, North Africa, and East Africa. And so they were bringing back ideas of these elaborate costumes and exotic people. So a lot of things are happening. I will point out a little bit inappropriately, but it is worth mentioning that a lot is happening on this dock. These are ships most likely of prostitution, because these are sailors who have been on shipboard, for years sometimes, and you see a little kind of like a canopy, and this would be maybe like a little brothel here. You see some other things I won't mention, but we have some people hugging and greeting each other in different costumes. They're resting on the quay. We have animals. So people are gathering here to welcome back people who have been traveling, but also to see the great, this display of power and shipbuilding. Now, for want of time, we're going to move on. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the French landscape painters. Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot was one of the greatest 19th century French landscape painters. Corot was very important to the development not only of the Impressionist painting, but he was a Barbizon painter. And the Barbizon painters went into the Barbizon woods and painted. This is outside of Fontainebleau. And they began to do what's called plein air painting. And so they took their brushes and their easels and they went outside and they painted. And that was the development early on with Corot, Dapnier, and others to start to do this landscape painting for the sake of the beauty of the landscape, and that eventually develops into Impressionism. Now, Corot loved to travel in Italy, and this is done, I believe, on his second trip to Italy, and he captures a remarkable city called Volterra. And again, I was very blessed in September of 2019 to visit Volterra. And why did I visit Volterra? Well, I happened to be in Italy in the Tuscan region, along with Venice, and I had seen this painting in the Timken, this very own Timken painting. Every painting we were looking at today, except for the Trébucheuse, is in the Timken. And I always saw this painting in our French gallery, and I was just captivated by it. What is Volterra? Volterra is a medieval town. You can see a medieval structure here, but it also is a site of remarkable ancient ruins from Rome, Roman ruins, and as well as Etruscan artifacts and ruins. I became very interested in Etruscan history. The Etruscans predated the Romans. And so if you go to the city of Volterra, this medieval city, you can go to these museums and walk around the town and see artifacts, Etruscan and Roman artifacts. And Corot was very captivated by it as well. In fact, so much so, he did at least 5 or 6 sketches of this very area. And he went back in his studio and painted it. He didn't necessarily do plein air, but he did sketch to get an idea and then bring it back to his studio. So we have a man on horseback. It gives us a little bit of a perspective. We have someone here resting. It's hard to determine if it's a man or a woman, but he shows a man on horseback going along a pathway. Interesting enough, the pathway doesn't seem too definable, so it almost looks like he's going to take the horse right into the rocky promontory. But suffice to say, he does capture the light of this Tuscan countryside. It's a little outside of Florence, about an hour and a half by car. Now, I do want to move on to at least spend about 10 minutes with our American collection. And this is the work of Thomas Birch. Now, Thomas Birch was an early member of the Hudson River Painters. And you might say, oh, that's interesting. This is seascape. Well, remember I mentioned landscapes can also incorporate urban scenes and marine paintings. And he was very influenced by Vernet, the painting I showed you just a few slides ago. He was British, but he came to America. His father was an engraver, so he was always interested in art. And Birch became involved with the Hudson River School. And the Hudson River Painters began with the work, I believe it was in the later part of the 1820s, with Thomas Cole. And Thomas Cole was very influential in developing this connection to nature, using the teachings of Emerson and Thoreau and the Transcendentalist movement, and saying that we don't have to go to church necessarily. We can look at the ineffable beauty of nature and become religiously inspired. And so, but the Hudson River Painters were very diverse. And I'm going to show you that as we go through the collection. So right now I'm going to concentrate on this maritime painter from the Hudson River School. And here we have a ship in distress. This is a very large painting. It's magnificently painted. We have these translucent waves. We have this action here. The ship is almost ready to capsize. We have the torn sails, the snapped mast here, mason mast. We have a steamship trying to get there quickly. We have a rescue boat. These people are being lowered from lifeboats. We see that the ship is probably going to collapse or roll over pretty quickly. We have the lighthouse. We have this rocky promontory. And what's interesting about this painting is Thomas Birch was very interested in the work of J.M.W. Turner, who lived about the same time as Birch. And he was also a British painter. And remember I told you that there was kind of categories of landscape painting, like the sublime, for example. And one of the reasons why we have different categories is this is not a sublime landscape. This is more showing how man can be overcome by nature. And that was the interest of J.M.W. Turner. A contemporary of Turner's and a little bit earlier than Birch was John Constable. And he was an English landscape painter too, but his landscapes showed man in a peaceful coexistence with nature. But Turner like Birch, is showing kind of the opposite. Thomas Birch became very famous during the Battle of 1812 because he did a lot of depictions of those battles. This is a much later painting. This was done prior to the Civil War. Another thing that Birch did that was kind of interesting, he did a companion piece for this. So there's one of a boat peacefully in a harbor, but this one, of course, shows man being overcome by nature. Now, one of our magnificent landscapes is Albert Bierstadt's Choluk Falls, Yosemite. And this is done around the time of the Civil War. Bierstadt was a second generation Hudson River painter. Now, with artists like Cole, for example, they began to paint the Hudson River Valley. But other artists, and especially in the second half, this is about 40 years later, they began to branch out. And they didn't just do like the Catskills and Hudson River, they did the grandeur of the Sierra Nevada and Yosemite. And so Bierstadt was commissioned by the government to come out on a surveying expedition. Some of the surveying were done for the railroad and to discover the land beyond the east. And he was asked to capture this beautiful landscape. Now, you have to understand that photography had been invented at this time. Remember, Matthew Brady during the Civil War depicted battles, but that was daguerreotype and a much more cumbersome way of depicting nature. So what did Bierstadt do? He brought his painting supplies on the surveying expedition, which he loved. He loved going on these, and he wanted to see like Native Americans and buffalo, and he was just so romantically looking at these things. But he does capture the party. It's at dusk after a long day of painting and surveying, and they're about to have dinner here. There's a fire, and there's some people resting and building the fire. We have some horses being hobbled here. They can maybe drink from the Merced River. We have this magnificent waterfall. At this time, it was, besides Niagara, was the largest waterfall known in the United States. And so he would take these sketches and go back to his studio and paint these magnificent landscapes. He, as I mentioned, was from Germany and really became famous during the 19th century. He was so famous that people would really line up and pay something like 50 cents just to see his grand landscapes. Well, 50 cents, at that time, that was quite a bit of money. So here he depicts in a very vertical manner, in a Hudson River style, the grandeur of the Yosemite Valley. Now, Thomas Moran, a very interesting man. He was also part of the second generation of Hudson River painters, but like some of them, he also wanted to go to Italy and study the landscape painting. So here we have the Campania, and that is the region outside of Rome, in the southern part of the country outside of Rome, and he captures this aqueduct, a Roman aqueduct from about 2,000 years ago. And this aqueduct was quite legendary, and it was commissioned, if I'm not mistaken, well, I'm not going to say the Roman emperor. It was commissioned by a Roman emperor, and you can see this beautiful outline of this 2,000-year-old aqueduct, and it leads our eye right into this countryside and into actually a little bit of a cityscape. And then we have some beautiful Roman ruins as well. So we have an aqueduct and the Roman ruins. Now, even though this does depict somewhat of a landscape, the Campania outside of Rome, it is also Arcadian. Arcadian in that it is so exquisitely depicted. It is so quiet and pastoral and remarkable. And you can see that the light is so prominent. The light is captured in the sky and these clouds and the pink light and these flowing just greenery and plants. And it is remarkable. Now, Moran also painted, obviously, the American landscape, but what he is very famous for is his paintings were so influential that he began to take up the idea that we should have a national parks system. And because of the work of Moran and others, we have today a national park system. I'm sorry, I'm racing a little bit because we don't have much time and I have a few more paintings to do. Again, this is George Innes Oricia. He too went to Rome and he was a Hudson River painter. And he too went to Rome and its environs to capture the landscape. And here we have, again, this is outside of Rome as well. And we have a city here with a cupola, and that was made by Bernini during the Baroque. And so he captures that. And then again, we have kind of he looked at the Dutch, and we have sort of this Dutch horizon line. We have a moon, so it's probably the latter part of the evening. And it's very quiet. It's very contemplative. Just like this painting I showed you, it's what I would call elegiac. An elegiac painting is one that makes us think it's kind of mournful and sorrowful. This is not quite that, but it is quiet and is contemplative. And we see people at the end of the day when their day is kind of winding down and they're quietly going over this bridge. And we see a caravan of people and we see water under the bridge is kind of dark and this beautiful waterfall and the city, landscape in the city. So this is another representation of the Hudson River painters who went into the Italian landscape to capture its beauty. Now, one of our most famous paintings, and we just have a couple more, and I just see I only have a minute or two, is Eastman Johnson's The Cranberry Harvest, Island of Nantucket. Eastman Johnson, this is probably his finest work, and it shows over 40 people depicted picking cranberries before. It's not a bog, it's a drier landscape. And what he's showing is man, a community working together to create a goal, to have a goal. And he beautifully, not only is he a remarkable figurative painter, but he's an incredible landscape painter. And two, he studies the details of the people pulling the little cranberries. You can see the light, it's almost like chiaroscuro, it falls on these people. You see this woman watching to see, you can't really see it here, but her young son is carrying a little baby. And so it took over 17 preparatory drawings to do this painting, and it beautifully captures how America, the agrarian way of life is kind of moving away, and we're getting an industrial, well, it's way beyond industrialization, but our cities are changing, and America is no longer this quiet agrarian nation, but it is becoming industrialized and wars happen. So it's quite a bit of change. But I did want to, before I wrap it up, I do have my final painting really fast. This is Fitzhenry Lane, Castine Harbor in Maine. Castine Harbor was a battle area for the Revolutionary War. It was one of our worst defeats during the Revolution. And he captures the beauty of it in what's called a luminous painting. The luminous were a subcategory of the Hudson River painters. They were called luminous because they were interested in luminosity, light. He was definitely influenced by the Dutch. He studied Dutch artists such as Robert Salmon and others who painted Dutch marine paintings. He looked at Van Rysdale. You can see this low horizon line. You can see all kinds of clouds, cumulus, stratus, etc. You can see the boats quietly on the harbor. It's almost like a grid. And unlike the birch painting, man is coexisting peacefully in nature. Just two more comments. He was interested in becoming a naval officer. He was raised in the maritime. His father was a map or sailmaker. I think he was a sailmaker. And so he always wanted to be a naval officer or a sailor. And he developed polio as a young child. So he decided to use his ability as an artist to capture these quiet ports along the eastern seaboard, Gloucester, Castine Harbor, and they're always quiet, and they're not really narrative paintings. He doesn't want to put a story so much in it, but just capture, again, that word, ineffable, almost indescribable, the beauty of these particular towns. And so we see it's light filled, it's reminiscent of the Dutch and Flemish, low horizon line, and then again, these exquisite clouds, because he too would go along the shoreline in these little skiffs with a friend, and he would sketch and paint and show that beauty and nature is all around us. So the Hudson River painters were basically working from about 1827, 25 till the really beginning of the 20th century. And like, if you look at this, you can think about what is happening in other countries. For example, in France, we have the emergence of not so much the Impressionists quite yet, but we do have the the Barbizon painters. And remember, it's with Desgenais-sur-Lève, I talked about 10 years later, that we begin to really incorporate more landscape in France, and then they go on to the Impressionists. But the Hudson River painters earlier on, 1820s, were beginning to really see landscape as a truly independent genre. And that is why we consider the Hudson River painters really the first truly American school of art. And then, of course, later on, we get the Ashcan School, Abstract Expressionism. But the Hudson River painters were really the first truly American school. And I do see our time is up because it's a 45-minute lecture, and I believe Samantha will see that we might have some questions, I hope. I'd love to have some questions.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Karen. What a fantastic presentation. A virtual round of applause. I see Sharon has her hand up. You can go ahead, Sharon.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the great presentation. You didn't make it boring at all, so thanks. I have a question about, is it the medium that we are viewing by being on a screen that so many of the artists' foreground are so dark and hard to see? Is it better in person?
Always. And, I just want to say, unfortunately, we have to pull from these resources that aren't always duplicating the color very well. And for example, Samantha works very hard to put these PowerPoint presentations together for me. And sometimes, right, Samantha, you can see, like with the Caravallis, the color, if you see, I hope our collection, and when you go back in the fall, you'll see the Caravallis, the colors are so muted in the slide. I call them slides, in the image on the screen. And it's so much more exquisite if you would see it in person. And that's really unfortunate, because when I studied art history, and I know Samantha doing the same as a graduate student in art history and an instructor, wouldn't you say it takes even really good publishers to even create good images in books, right, Samantha?
Yeah. Sometimes the images just, aren't the best quality. All the time I would, study a piece and have studied it for months, and then I'll actually go see it in person. It looks completely different. So it's pretty common, but yeah.
So I think that is a standard problem. Now, some of them, like the Thomas Moran, I thought the coloration was really nice, really excellent.
Sure.
But it just, unfortunately, sometimes, and most of the images I thought translated very well, except like a couple of them, in the Caravallis is probably the worst in terms of kind of too muted. But that's just what happens. That's just part of the problem. Yeah.
And then quickly, how is plain art named?
Plain art, it's to go outside in nature.
Okay.
So it's French, plein air.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Thank you for asking.
Of course. Thank you so much, Sharon. Let's see. I see a couple comments thanking us for the lecture. I see one on Facebook saying, thank you for the wonderful lecture and the description of the landscape. So thank you again, Karen. If anyone else has any other questions, feel free to add them to the chat while you may be thinking. I'll just mention again, as I mentioned earlier, all of these talks, previous ones that we've done, are posted on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. So please feel free to go back and check those out while the Timken is still closed. We're happy to bring you this virtual programming. If you would like information on future tours, as Sharon mentioned earlier, things through the Getty, all of that good stuff, and things through here at the Timken, please check out our website and get the information for those on there as well. I don't think I see any other questions. So again, thank you so much, Karen, for such a wonderful talk. Always a pleasure to have you. And enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.